Hi, my name is Katie May, and this is the Baby May podcast. And in this episode, I'll be talking about the systematic barriers when it comes to generational healing. So, a trigger warning for those who feel uncomfortable listening to the topic of systematic racism and the social barriers when it comes to accessing support that is needed within communities, specifically discriminated communities. I wanted to talk about this because I think it is really important to talk about generational healing and healing as an individual. But I think it's also important to talk about the barriers when it comes to accessing support when it comes to this healing process. Because there's definitely a lot of people speaking as to how they want to heal as a community and how they want to support one another as a community. I really truly believe that there is such a strong support and such a strong sense of wanting to heal together within Indigenous communities. I really do see that and I feel it. But when it comes to specific types of support, there is not enough access within many of these communities. And unfortunately, I think that kind of plateaus someone's ability to be able to advocate for their own health. At least that's how it feels for myself, even though I've only had limited experience with physical medical services. My experience with mental health services so far has been quite challenging, just because if I'm trying to go to mental health services that aren't specifically from Nunavut or aren't specifically for Inuit or Indigenous people, there's quite a hard time being able to register me under my NHIB. And NHIB is it's my healthcare rights as an Inuk beneficiary under the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. And I know it's a very specific type of healthcare rights. And I understand that because it is for a specific territory, specifically for the beneficiaries of that territory, having that kind of system nationalized is quite difficult. I find it kind of confusing and disappointing to see that there isn't more of an effort to kind of nationalize that kind of system for registering and going to mental health services and medical services. That system should be in place in every community of Canada, if not just about every community, at least the major cities. And I feel like within the major cities, within healthcare systems, I feel like there shouldn't be a complete shock of hearing NHIB, because some people haven't even heard what that is or haven't been fully explained what that is. And that just creates a lot of confusion. And I think for people who work at front desk, they're great people. I'm not trying to sound mean, but I think when I approach them with my Nunavut healthcare card, and it's a system that they're not familiar with, it's not in their system, I think I have been treated as an inconvenience to their time because they don't know what to do. And personally, I don't like to feel that way when I'm trying to go find mental health services or medical services, because obviously I'm going out there to try to find the support that I need, and I'm going to a place that gives that support to other people, but just because I'm under a certain type of agreement, there's a lot of difficulties within that. And I can understand that. I definitely think that I'm not entirely angry, but I do find it not just an inconvenience of my time, because I have to go to so many different places to try to find the support that I need, but it's also like when I am being treated as an inconvenience, it's emotionally hard to deal with, because I am aware that I am not necessarily inconvenienced at this person's individual time, but it's more so like they don't have any personal biases against me. It is the system at place that is not designed for me. That is difficult to sit alone with. So that is the reason why when I go to medical services, and even at time when I'm registering for mental health services, I don't want to be doing that process alone. And I have noticed a big difference when I go to those kinds of places with a person who is white, specifically a white man. Unfortunately, the best way for me to advocate at times is to have someone with more privilege than me to advocate for me, which doesn't sit right. It doesn't really sit right with me, and I know it doesn't really sit right with other people who do this for me, who I'm really grateful for. But I have become afraid to do these kinds of things alone without that kind of support, because the times I do it alone, I just don't get the services that I need. Even though there is a difficulty to do this within Nunavut, it's not as difficult with my experience at least. I've never had to deal with medical travel. For example, if I got sick or injured and I needed medical services that, like while I'm in Nunavut, if I needed medical services that surpass the capabilities of what could happen in Nunavut, then I need to be traveled outside of the territory to either Ottawa, Montreal, Winnipeg, even Yellowknife. I'm sure there's a few other places that you could be sent to. Like some smaller communities within Nunavut do get sent to just Iqaluit, but that's more so like pregnant women who are being sent to Iqaluit to have birth. Like I said, I never had to have that experience before, so I don't understand the difficulties of that, but from what I've heard, that also just seems to be quite a difficult process. But because when you go to a health center or the hospital in Nunavut, which is the one hospital in Nunavut for the whole territory, they already have the NHIB system in place. And that is automatic. You don't need to go through a whole thing each time you go through to the hospital or to the health center because it's Nunavut. And I don't expect it to be so simple as that when it comes to health services outside of Nunavut. But I would hope that at least the major cities where Inuit are going for medical services would have those types of systems in place already, because it is common knowledge that there are Inuit traveling for medical services out of territory cities. Like I said, I am confused and somewhat frustrated to see that there is a lack of commitment to ensuring Inuits' health rights. I don't know what the system is like for other Indigenous people who are non-Inuit, but I hope it's not as difficult, and I hope that other Indigenous people are not being turned down as much as I have been, or people initially turning me down, and then my privileged friends intervene and say, well, actually, I think you should try. And when I say like what that I do bring these friends of mine, it's not like I don't speak up for myself at all. It's just that I tend to be spoken over a lot, and when I bring a friend, it seems like they don't get spoken over or they don't get pushed aside. So that is kind of the reason why, like I said earlier, I do prefer to have someone there with me. This experience with trying to find medical care has just been quite frustrating. And it's just one of the examples of like the systematic racism at play. I wanted to get more specifically into like how these things really do have an effect on Indigenous lives, because when we are learning that there's a system in place that is not designed for us, it really makes us feel like there is no place for us, even though this is our homelands and this is where we've been for generations. It is a really strange feeling. I don't know how to quite explain it. It does make me feel quite emotional. It doesn't make me feel good because it makes me wonder, as much as I feel connected and supported by my community and other Indigenous communities that I'm welcomed into, it makes me wonder, like, where is the bridge between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people? I definitely know that there are many bridges and many healthy relationships between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, even in my own life. But I guess I mean like socially at large. I feel like that bridge is just like, it does not have a good foundation. It is definitely being built on by many like well-meaning people who are trying to educate themselves, trying to learn about one another, and trying to really commit to supporting one another and treating one another as human beings, because we are. Like, we deserve to respect one another and respect ourselves and to accept ourselves and accept others. I think that is something that has definitely been happening for a long time. And it's a really good process to be able to see that. But that social aspect, there's not a good foundation, like I said, with that like bridge building. The foundation of the systems in place, it's not built in a way that's going to actually support a social change at large. And I don't expect these things to be taken care of fast-paced. I know these things take time. And I know there has been a lot of progress being made throughout the years. I recognize that. I just think that many people would agree with me when I say it feels slow. It feels slower than it should be. And I know that many people had the capability to not fasten the pace, but make it feel sustainable. It feels like there has definitely been changes that have been made, and they have greatly impacted the lives of Indigenous people and other people who have been discriminated against by the system. But there's still a lot of room to work on. And I think a lot of people will agree with me on that. I guess what I mean is like, I don't know if there's such a commitment within our systems to make the change more at a sustainable pace. Because I really have times where I don't think the kind of changes I want to see are going to happen within my lifetime. I feel like I'm working towards something that will surpass me. And that is why I like to work in policy when it comes to the systematic changes and understanding why is it so easy for people to be discriminated against. It really comes down to the policies and seeing that like Indigenous people and other marginalized people are not fully protected to have the equity that is needed to be able to be functioning at a sustainable level. I guess what I mean by that is like for people who live in poverty, for example, it could be really hard to be able to gain access to the resources to have a better education so that you could then commit to a better job that requires a higher education. Like there's a lot of social barriers in place for people who live in poverty to be able to get out of poverty. And that's kind of what I mean. There's so many barriers in place for discriminated people or people who have a really big lack of privilege. It is really hard to be able to get like a 9-to-5 job. It is really hard to get into post-secondary because the systems that are in place have not supported us to be able to do those things. But it feels like it's a type of cycle that has been specifically designed for it to be a cycle until it is broken. And I think that cycle of discrimination, of social barriers, systematic barriers, and that is really affecting the cycle of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational abuse. I really do think that these two types of cycles do go hand in hand. In order to address one another, we need to work on both. And like I said, I really do believe that the Indigenous communities of Canada, from my knowledge, have really been trying. And it's been really hard work. And there has been a lot of change within our communities because we committed ourselves to the healing, to the community healing. But there are limits because of the systematic barriers. And there needs to be changes within the system. And those changes need to be done through policy changing so that a better foundation could be built and that services that are specifically needed could be provided. And there could be more education within our health sectors, within our schools, and within our workspaces as to creating more awareness of these types of issues and learning how to support one another when dealing with these kinds of issues. I think a lot of people have a sense of helplessness when dealing with this because it feels like things haven't been changing or haven't been changing enough. And I think quite a few people feel like the changes that we're working towards may not be within our lifetimes. But I do know many people do want to see that change. I don't think anyone really expects it to be fast-paced or to happen instantly, but I think people just want to see that there is a commitment and there will be a commitment from there on. As I think about this, I think about my own personal commitment towards this kind of work. I feel committed to growing outside of the cycle that I was born into. I also want to be able to build a good foundation within myself where I feel supported by myself, where I know I could rely on myself, and I guess have a better sense of self-esteem. There are times where it feels really difficult or nearly impossible to be able to see those kind of goals. They can't really like be achieved one and done. It's an ongoing process and it always will be, but it feels like that kind of work can't even be done because of what I've been taught to believe in myself and people like me. And that is that is definitely part of the intergenerational trauma and abuse, but that's also supported by the systematic racism. A lot of the intergenerational trauma that I see in my life, it is a really big direct result of residential school and basically the whole colonization process. There's so many things I can specifically get into, and I really do want to get into them. It's hard to summarize it all. The entire process of colonization for Inuit specifically, it separated entire communities and families from one another. It was a relocation process for the communities that are developed today to be built. And that relocation process, from what I've read and from what I've watched in documentaries, there was a big sense of disconnection and isolation from one another. And when you add on many other traumatic events within the process of colonization, I think that just created a big sense of alienation and an inability to gain access to support. And then when you learn about residential school and how the church was affecting the Inuit communities and the government as well, you really learn the assimilation process was not just to act white. It was to completely erase one's identity as an Inuk person. And that really just taught that when you are Inuk, that means you are less valued or there is no value. And that has a direct effect on your self-esteem, how you feel about yourself and how you're treated by yourself. A lot of the abuse that people face during residential school and even the abuse from the RCMP and other governmental representatives or church representatives, I think that abuse was really internalized because of how traumatic it was. When that internalization process happens, I think that becomes this really low point of self-hatred, but also self-abuse. And I do believe when you're at that point, you don't just tolerate that treatment to yourself, you're tolerating that treatment in general. And I believe that just from what I've seen, I believe that could create a vulnerable situation where that person could be abusive to others. I feel like that's what I've seen with the trauma and abuse being passed down through generations. It is that hatred that was taught to them and then internalized being passed down. Unfortunately, a lot of people I know at least have been given the tools or accessibility to be able to deal with that in a healthy way. And I find myself being in really similar situations and reacting in similar ways that I was taught to react, with anger and with hatred and with violence. And that's not something I like to do. It really hurts the people around me, but also it hurts to see that I'm hurting them. It's at those times where I don't know what to do because there's nothing that could help me. It's kind of going back to I don't feel supported in the ways that I need, whether it's through mental health services or through medical services. Both of them do have a great emotional effect on me, but they also have a physical effect on me at times. And that just puts me into such a reactionary mode. And I was never taught the tools as to how to deal with the feeling of helplessness. I was taught to just sit with that feeling. And I don't want that for anyone. I especially don't want that for people in my community because I know that that's something that has been perpetuated for quite a long time, and it still is. And I don't want Inuit or anyone to feel helpless. I don't want people to feel like when they do go seek help that they're an inconvenience because they're under a certain type of agreement. I don't want people or myself to get to such a reactionary point because I wasn't able to learn the tools to calm myself down or to be able to deal with my emotions in a healthier way or to express them in a healthier way. I think that's kind of why when I think about some of my people I know that don't like doctors and don't like going out to get help, it could be a combination of not wanting to admit that you need help, but I think it's also knowing that when you do go seek help, it is going to be very difficult, not just because it's a progress, in terms of like getting healthier and things like that, but it's difficult in the sense that like finding access to have support on that progress. That's also frustrating. And I think I understand a lot of people's hesitance when it comes to reaching out for support, professional support, but even just personal support between friends or family or whatever. That's a feeling that I'm definitely trying to challenge a lot. Not only is it hard to advocate for my own health, my own self, but like I said, I was taught to not do that kind of a thing. I should clarify. I guess I wasn't taught that on a society level. My family, they're very passionate about advocating for ourselves and each other. But I also notice there's times of discouragement or times of helplessness because that kind of support we give one another, we don't necessarily experience it as much as we need outside of our communities. And that is why it is so important for us to build bridges between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. There needs to be able to feel that sense of connection. Without that connection, I think a lot of people just feel discouraged and as if there is no space for them. I think just vocalizing your support, that really does have a bigger impact than people tend to believe. There are many ways as to go about to like how to build a better foundation when it comes to policy, working within all these social sectors, health sectors, governmental systems, workspaces, most importantly, education spaces. The policies, they all need to be changed. I'm sure there are many great policies in place for some really great environments. From what I've been researching and other people that I work with, there's such a great number of policies in place that are directly discriminatory or vulnerable to have discriminatory actions happen and then there be no consequences. There are definitely places that are supposed to be safe spaces and supposed to not have any like hateful acts happen. But unfortunately, because there are loopholes in some policies, or sometimes just people who are corrupt making those policies, that leaves room for those kinds of things to happen. With consequences or without consequences, usually. It's usually without consequences. And from what I've seen, a lot of Indigenous people or people of color or people with disabilities just leave their work environments or whatever educational environments, wherever they were spending their time in, and were hoping to make a space for themselves. They leave because they feel like there is no space for them. And there is no space for them to be respected and accepted. I don't think that is something that should be acceptable. That is why there's such an emphasis on creating safe spaces that are usually exclusive. For Indigenous communities, there is safe spaces that are Indigenous specific because of experiences that have happened. And the same could go for many other types of communities. I don't think most people want to be exclusive. I think a lot of people want to be as inclusive as they could be, but that exclusion is there for safety reasons. That is where there needs to be a lot of education between our communities, learning how to reconcile together. And I don't mean that just like necessarily in the truth and reconciliation way. And it is a part of truth and reconciliation for sure. It is something that could be happening between not just Indigenous communities, but communities that have been systematically discriminated against. And I do have faith that these kinds of relationships and education could happen because I do think a lot of people do mean well and just haven't been given the access to learn about these things. And requires a lot of vulnerability on both sides, and it requires a lot of commitment on both sides to learning about each other and learning as to how to coexist and work together on these issues and then just work together from there on. I do think that's something that is definitely possible because it's happening and it's been happening. I hope that it happens at a greater scale eventually. And it seems to be happening as time goes on and people learn more and more. I hope we all grow. I just think that's how things go. It's a lovely process. It's a difficult process, but it's a beautiful process. It's a connecting process. At the end of the day, most people just want to feel connected to themselves and to one another. I do think that's possible. People do that. They've been doing that for a long time, since people have been alive. Of course, people also just like have had a lot of conflict between friends or family or whatever, but that's just people. I don't expect every single conflict and every single issue to be addressed and to be fixed. I just think that there are quite obvious things that could be worked on together. And I do think they're quite achievable goals. Again, I don't know if these goals could happen within my lifetime, but I sure hope they do. I feel hopeful about all of this. I do have times where I feel very pessimistic and I feel helpless. But when I get to talk to my coworkers, to my friends, people I care about these sorts of things, I realize that there's so much work being done, not even just in policy, but as well within our own individual, personal, day-to-day lives. There's a lot of work being done. That's just incredible. I think it's lovely, and it's something I want to commit myself to, as well as committing myself to learning how do I support myself? How do I learn about myself? What do I want to work towards for myself? Because all of those definitely have a social component, because I do want to be with people in my life. But I also got to think about what is good for me, what do I actually need, and then how do I communicate with myself and to others about those kinds of needs. I understand that this is quite a broad episode, but I do think these kinds of things all do go hand in hand. I want to bring up the topic of intersectionality because when I reflect on everything that I just spoke about in this episode, it's kind of a really long-winded version of being able to explain intersectionality and how when it comes to dealing with social issues and making systematic changes, there's a lot of intersectionality of issues and just a lot of components at play. So when I'm talking about all of this, I can't really give any one solution because there isn't just one solution. There's a lot of work that needs to be done based on learning on like what can be done and how can we do it. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think a way to work on that is to just have more positions of power or like positions where there's decision making being made. Those positions should be accessible and filled by more people who have been misrepresented or underrepresented. Because when it comes to Indigenous health issues, Indigenous people most likely know what to say and what to address because they have their own personal experiences and they have their community's experiences as well. So it just takes a certain type of awareness when it comes to like dealing with these issues and then learning on how to like communicate these together and then addressing them together and working on what we can. So yeah, I just wanted to like put that little thing in there at the end. And I know that this was quite a broad topic episode, and it was definitely meant to be. I thought of so many ways as to how to talk about this. I feel pretty all right with this one. So thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you for listening to the Baby May podcast. Bye.